Welcome again, everyone, and welcome back, Danya, to continue our conversation on disaster planning. Take it away.
All right, thank you. Welcome back. I hope all of you had a successful week in working on your disaster plans. I'm just going to let you know that there's a lot of meetings going on in my house today, so I'm going to be stopping my video, but that's okay because I'm really not why you're here. You're here for the information. So what I want to start off by doing is asking all of you to do a little bit of group participation, and I would be very interested to know how your week went in terms of working on your pocket response plan, and if you ran into any difficulties, what were they, or what did you find particularly helpful? So I think you all have the power, correct me if I'm wrong, Christy, to unmute yourselves. So if you'd like to join in the conversation, that would be really great. So I know it can be a little difficult to be the first person, but it would be nice to hear from somebody.
Hi, this is Annie Miller in Greenwich, New York.
Hi, Annie.
I never have a problem being first. Even when what I have to say is that today is our first day of being open to the public. So
Wow.
as far as I got on this was just going around and filling in the contacts list for sort of the basic stuff,
Yeah.
building utilities, first responders, some things like that. That is as far as I've gotten.
But that's it's a really important step to have all of that information in one place.
Yeah, I didn't realize like how much hunting around I would have to do. And, given that probably all of that stuff I looked at would have been burned up if there was a fire.
Yeah.
Uh,
Right. And, even if you were, more of a flood situation and you're standing outside your library, how much time do you think you really want to take in going to doing all of this searching for these phone numbers, compared to just knowing it's right there in your wallet?
right. Yeah. So it's so far it's already helpful.
Great. So, hopefully there will be some, you'll have some free time to keep working on it. I just also have to say I was in Greenwich on Wednesday because I had to get a new queen for my hive. So I was over.
Oh, okay. Yes,
I was over on the outskirts of Greenwich.
Well, come to the library. Our doors are open now.
Well, I hadn't thought about it when I was there, and I'm like, no, I don't think they're probably open quite yet. How about anybody else? Has it been helpful so far? Have you had struggled finding people or finding resources? But if nobody has any more comments, but please feel free to chat them if you want. What I'd like to do is shift my screen and give you some ideas of where you can actually take your pocket response plan. So I worked on a large project in Massachusetts a couple of years ago, and a colleague of mine out in California was kind enough to share with me the outcomes of a larger project that they did with libraries, archives, and museums out in California. So here we can see one of the, most basic, fill in your pocket response plan. So we have institutional contacts, our disaster teams, our utilities, and all of those things that are on the front side of the pocket response plan. But on the back here, we can see that they've made their first column in large print, their priority collections, with the next two columns, some of which should be familiar to those of you who were here last week, showing their maps and their pictures of where you could find these items. And then what I really like about this one is they created, particularly to them, a response checklist that they could go through and really be able to almost not have to think about anything in the heat of the moment. So one of the things that your disaster plan really helps you do, as we said last week, is to take the stress of decision making off of your shoulders. So having things like, checklists and things of that nature that are really easy to just move through. I'm a particular fan of flowcharts. They're something that you can create to have right here in your plans. You can see it doesn't have to be anything fancy, just fairly straightforward. This one from Placer County, I really like because they've taken it a step further and color coded everything. So you have different areas of focus highlighted. So your first responders are all in red. Your building utilities are in blue. So they've really done a great job. And what I like is here in the bottom center, they have given you a floor plan, not with where the priority collections are, but where all of the exits are. So staff have an easy way to know exactly where all of the exits are to help people get out of the building, especially if they find themselves in an area that they're not normally in. I also like the fact that in big letters on the backside, they haven't made a lot of changes, but what they have is just put a big reminder to not panic. And that's a big thing about disaster response. And we'll get to that a little bit later in today's webinar. So the Junior Museum and Zoo from Palo Alto, California, also has a nice floor plan. And what they've done is they've grayed out where collections are and then given you the ranking of what those priorities would be. One of the things I also like is they've put a little picture of the salvage wheel, which we'll get to in a bit, so that people know what to look for in their emergency packets, because the salvage wheel is something that will be a very handy reference tool for all of you. So here, the Northwest Pacific Library and Archives has, just really made their map larger and more easily accessible. And of course, because they were sharing this, they did not exactly tell us what their priorities were, which is just fine. But you can see that there's a lot of different activities taking place. And one of the things I really like about this plan is they've actually given you their address. Because I will be honest, I worked at Syracuse University for 5 years, and I could not tell you the street address for Bird Library, although I went there every day for 5 years. No, I could not tell you what it was, and I definitely couldn't have told you if I had to call in for an emergency. So it's a great idea. It seems like something so simple, but here again, it's a great idea. And especially when you have new staff members, they may not be as, we talk a lot about, if you do dance lessons or you learn to knit, there's a lot to be said about muscle memory. Well, our brains are also a muscle. And so the more we use certain items and bring them up from our memories, the more rapidly they will be retrievable. So if you don't always think about your address, it's not going to come to you if you have to call the emergency services. So that's a great idea. And then their backside is just really simple. You can get colorful in your maps, and this is all down to, again, who you have on staff, what, abilities and capabilities you have in-house. But it's also nice because here, not only do you have the red, orange, or the red, I guess, salmon and orange priorities, it's also telling you where the keyed doors are, both outside and inside, so that if your first responders come, somebody's going to need to provide a key, or you're going to have to make sure that you have external and internal keys in your Knox box. And a Knox box, there's other brand names of it. Knox is the one that I'm most familiar with, and it's Knox as in Fort Knox. A Knox box is a box that's attached to the outside of your building, and it holds essentially master keys to your building, so that when the fire department is called and comes on site, if you aren't there to unlock the doors for them, they are the only ones with the key to your Knox box. And so they can get into the Knox box and unlock your doors. If they don't have that option, they're going to knock them down. This project I worked on in Massachusetts, I worked with instructors from the fire academy there, and they all agreed that one of the things that firemen love doing is taking an axe to a door. They don't know why, but they just find it so much fun to knock down a door with an axe. So if you have an attachment to your front door or your back door, be sure you have a Knox box so they don't take your door out with an axe. Just a helpful little thing. And then this institution has a bunch of fire safes, and they also tell you where those are. So it's, really handy to have some of these other things identified as well. One of the things that I would change about this is, rather than using Martha's office and Lori's office, I would make them more generic and give the position title instead of the first name, because as we know, people do change jobs. And if you aren't good about keeping up with your disaster plan, it may be very confusing if Lori hasn't been there for the last 10 years. And yes, Amanda, it's Knox as in Fort Knox, so Knox. I'd have said like Knox blocks, but I'm in New York, so it has to be Jello, which doesn't work in this case. So yes, Knox as in Fort Knox. And then if you're a larger library, you can see Fresno has decided that it wants a little more in terms of a footprint for its maps. It's got 3 floors. And even they go a step further, showing where fire hoses are, although this shouldn't be an issue in New York, because if I remember correctly, when I was at Syracuse, you couldn't have fire hoses in the building anymore. So I distinctly remember them coming and taking our fire hoses out of the library. But they do show where fire extinguishers are. And this is really important, because I can't tell you how many institutions I've worked at. When you ask them, how many fire extinguishers do you have? Almost everybody knows how many. But when you ask them, where are they? People really have to stop and think, because you see them all the time. Yes, we have fire extinguishers. I see them all the time. But if you aren't paying attention to where they are, can you list them if you're not looking at them? So for all of you at home right now, where in your building are all of your fire extinguishers? And if you don't know, getting them on a floor map like this can be a really helpful thing. Again, they show where fire alarm panels are and the first aid kit, which is always a handy thing to know, especially if you have a children's library, because heaven only knows what's going to happen to children. And then the key box, which is a good thing to also know if you still have a key box. So, that way you can supply keys to your first responders if you need them, or you can tell them where it is. So again, they're not knocking down internal doors as well as your main front door. So, and here, you can see that it's not quite exactly the same layout. They've highlighted their collection priorities. And again, they've used a few more words, but that reminder to not panic. So there's just a lot of ways that you can go about this, and to get back to, you don't have to be fancy, is, here we have somebody just sat down on a piece of paper, drew out everything they needed to know, where water shutoffs were, where water hoses were, the power shutoff and the gas shutoff. It's all hand done. It's a rough, crude map, but you have all of the highlights so that you know where you are in the building. So it can be as complex or as simple as you want. And so then on the back side of this, they've likewise done internal floor maps showing you where, burglar alarm, the fire and alarm box is, the, heating units, restrooms, which are very handy to know if you find you have a water problem, fuse boxes, thermostats, fire extinguishers, and then their priority collections. So, going through these, what I've really wanted to do is give you a sense that your template for the pocket response plan is not meant to be the end all and be all of the plan. I mean, you can make that plan yours, make it fit who you are, and really work with your institution. And the only person who can do that, or the only people who can do that, are you. So, be really personal in these pocket response plans, because for a lot of us, these will probably be the only plan we really have. I will tell you that I have been waiting impatiently some days for D-Plan to be revised. I know it's in a major revision stage at the moment. And D-Plan is an online disaster planning template from the Northeast Document Conservation Center out in Boston. And it is extremely thorough, and can be very large and unwieldy. So I'm hoping that part of the revision is to streamline it for smaller institutions. I know when I was there, we had just started talking about it, and we had wanted to go to something more like a TurboTax kind of style forms, so that everything didn't print out. And that was the biggest problem with D-Plan. If you didn't fill something in, it still printed that stuff out. So keep an eye out. It should be coming, well, it was supposed to be out spring of this year, so I'm sure there's a delay now with COVID and everything. But for those of you who may be in larger institutions, it would be the next logical step after you complete your pocket response plan. But don't completely get rid of your pocket response plan, because you can't carry D-Plan in your wallet like you can the pocket response plan. So now that we have our plan, we need to figure out, what to do with it. We have it, it's great. So what do we do now? First thing we want to do is, of course, make sure that people actually have the plan. So you want to make sure that, I would say that, well, everybody on your disaster team has to have the plan. If your director is not on the disaster plan or the disaster team, they should have a copy as well. And then you can take just the call tree information and maybe post that near each of the telephones. So maybe you make a version with a lot less information, with checklists, or the flow chart. So if you find water, here's what you do. If you smell smoke, here's what you do, sort of thing. And post that by every telephone, so that no matter who is the first one to find the disaster, they know who and what to call. For some of us in small institutions, pretty much everybody's going to be on the disaster team. so everybody would get a copy. But if you're in a larger institution, you can determine who needs to know what information and get that to them. But everybody should at least have the basic what to do if sort of information that you would find in your pocket response plan. And then as you develop a plan more and D plan finally comes out, then your disaster team can have a more full and complete plan. And if you do something like D plan and you have insurance, you might want to share it with your insurance company, because this is showing them you have a plan and it can help to lower your insurance premiums. It's also a really good idea to share any sort of floor plans that you make with your local fire department, because again, if they know where the shutoffs are and where your important materials are, they can actually do something. So if they respond to a fire and there's no human life risk involved, they can take the time to throw fire blankets over important furniture or over important exhibit cases with your local history materials in them or something like that. But they would need to know what those items are and where they are so they can do it. Because when firefighters go to fight a fire, their first priority is human safety. Their second priority is actually preserving the structure. And for them, the concept of preserving the contents also falls in under that. So a lot of the firefighters I was working with in Massachusetts all agreed that, if they know the institution and they've talked to them in advance, done a walkthrough, gotten to know the building, gotten to know the collections, they would do what they could to help save it. So, don't forget that you can share floor plans and things like that with them as well. And it can make a big difference in what you can salvage and what you can't. So having your plan is all well and good, but it's not going to do anything except be essentially a single sheet Rolodex if you don't do any sort of training. So there are a lot of different ways that you can go about in terms of training. You can talk with your local fire department to see if you can actually get fire extinguisher training for your staff. And if you've never done a fire extinguisher training exercise, I highly recommend it. There's something very fun about setting fire to gasoline in an aluminum bushel barrel and going out and putting the fire out with a fire extinguisher. That was one of the programs we did when I was in central New York, and I'm a bit of a firebug, so I thought it was one of the best things in the world to do. But it also teaches your staff, just how much pressure there is in a fire extinguisher, how much time you actually have to use the fire extinguisher. And then they also go through a lot of safety precautions that if you've never stopped to think about it, you might not. And so, for example, if you're going to use a fire extinguisher, only use it if you are between the fire and the exit. So never have the fire between you and an exit if you're using a fire extinguisher. It sounds simple, but before I took that workshop, it was not something I would have thought about. I'd have probably walked around and, the fire and gotten stuck or something. So it's a really good training exercise to take, more than just for, working on, learning how to use a fire extinguisher in your institution, but it also teaches you a lot about fire safety at your own home too. You can do, if you don't do it already, you can do fire drills. I mean, like we did in school, the fire alarm goes off, you evacuate the building. If you evacuate the building, does everybody know to meet in one spot so you can make sure everybody's out? How are you going to ensure that your patrons are all safely out? And is this something you already do? And if it is, that's great. If not, it's probably something you should think about, especially, as we're coming back from a period of time where we haven't really been in our buildings and we may not have that, brain muscle memory to remind us of just exactly where to go. Because sometimes the closest exit may be behind you. For those of us who haven't flown for quite a while and for some strange odd reason missed those safety announcements at the beginning. You might want to do training in, various things related to your activities. So if you are going to have a big outdoor festival on your grounds, do you know what to do in the event of a tornado or an extreme, a severe thunderstorm? What happens if that blows up while you're there? Do do people know what to do? These are the kinds of little things that make for great brown bag lunch sorts of trainings. Another great way to do training is through a tabletop exercise. And so what I've done here for you is on the slide, I've given you a pretty simple example of a tabletop exercise. So what you do is you lay out a scenario for everybody on the disaster team, and you essentially walk through this scenario using your disaster plan. So if you were the first person back and you hear water dripping and you see the damage in your collections area, what do you do? And hopefully the first response is, I would take out my pocket response plan and see what it tells me to do. And that's great. And so then you can all pull out your pocket response plans, walk through them. And what a tabletop exercise like this is going to do is it's going to highlight areas that may be missing. So, maybe for some reason you couldn't find the phone number for your utility company that supplies your water. So, and you'd made a note, you're going to come back to it, you're going to find that number, but as we all know, life gets in the way. And so by going through this tabletop exercise, you might realize, oh, I never got that phone number. So it's going to be a prompt to, fix things like that. So, you can make these tabletop exercises very personal. They can be very small. They can be very elaborate. I have actually sat through day-long tabletop exercises. They're very intense, and I don't recommend them. But it's really easy to create a small tabletop exercise that would take up maybe 15 to 20 minutes of a meeting time. And, or you can do a brown bag lunch tabletop exercise. And they're great ways to get people using the disaster plan and, going through. And so, taking a look, oh, well, that's that storage area, and we've selected these 5 sections of shelving. Do any of these sections of shelving contain our priority collections? And if they do, what are they and what would we need to deal with first? So, you can really, really personalize these things. But training doesn't necessarily have to be only using your disaster plan. So one of the things that I did when I worked at Northwestern University and was the primary person on the disaster team is I would do safety walkthroughs. So whenever new staff started, they would have a rotation through all of the departments that new staff would get orientation in. And when they would come, I was actually one of the departments in and of myself. So people would come to conservation, I'd give them a tour, but then I would also give them a safety walkthrough of the building, showing them where fire extinguishers were, where fire poles were, where the exits were, and all of those sorts of things so that everybody knew and got oriented to the building from the safety perspective and the emergency perspective, rather than just, here are the books, here's your workstation, okay, go to it. So, in a smaller institution, it could be showing people where shutoff valves are, where your disaster supplies are, so that people can start thinking about it, knowing that it's an important issue to you from the first day that they're there. Don't forget that, continuing training is always available. Keep an eye out for more programs through DIPSNY and Northern New York, but also check out, if you aren't aware of it, the Connecting to Collections Care community. And the link to that will be in the slide notes that I send you, or that Christy will send you after the webinar. It's a great community. It's hosted out of the American Institute for Conservation, but it is not geared towards conservators. It is very much an open forum to anybody working with collections. And they do a wide range of different sorts of training, but they do regular webinars. And all of their webinars have been recorded, so you can go back and watch past webinars. For example, I did one on fire safety in particular. But they also had a webinar series called Protecting Your Collection. So that would just be kind of a more detailed look at writing a disaster plan, as well as there's a separate one on response. So those are two areas that you can get even more in depth than we're able to go in this webinar series. So there's a lot of opportunities for training. Oh, and Connecting to Collections Care is all free. So there's no cost involved in those. So for those of you who are still at home and wanting to learn some new things, I highly recommend checking the Connecting to Collections Care community. So I've kind of briefly touched on supplies, and we've talked about the disaster depots, but until that issue becomes more resolved, which it won't until people can actually get out and move around again, I thought I would talk to you about some of my favorite strategies for gathering supplies. And there's a couple of camps. Some people will tell you, you must have everything on hand before the disaster occurs, and it requires a closet, and you can't use that closet for anything else. And I'm of the opinion that you should just have the minimum supplies on hand to deal with the most likely emergencies. And in the event of a larger one, you can get the stuff. So you can, if the disaster depots are back up and running, you can utilize those. Otherwise, you can just run to Home Depot and get boxes and garbage bags, and they'll work just fine too. So I have worked with a lot of very small institutions that don't have a lot of space. And this image is actually from one of the institutions I worked with in Connecticut. And very small museum. They didn't have a lot of space, but they had enough room in the bathroom for a bucket, a 5-gallon bucket with a lid. And in there, they had plastic sheeting. They had some, when you could get them, N95 dust masks and latex or nitrile gloves. They had a couple of headlamps in there, and flashlights and sponges and duct tape, so that, if there was a leak and they had problems with leaks, they could grab the plastic, grab the duct tape, grab the sponge, dry off the wall, stick the plastic up with the duct tape, and then be able to take a little time to figure out what they were going to do next once the immediate problem was in hand. And so it all fit into that 5-gallon bucket. And then they had 2 fans on site that, for the most part, the staff used when they were in their offices because they didn't have air conditioning, but they also knew where they were so that they could likewise be grabbed very quickly. And it just was an unobtrusive lidded garbage can under the sink in the bathroom. And everybody knew what was in it, and they would know to grab it in the event of an emergency. What I would do is recommend that instead of having everything in its packaging, take the flashlights out of their bags, take the sponge out of its bag, so you're not fumbling with all of that in the event of an emergency. I also like to advocate for having essentially a trunk toolkit. You know, the kinds of toolkits you can get that have basic hand tools like screwdrivers and hammers and pliers. And then, you know, in kind of the toolkit to have string and maybe some more duct tape, caution tape, because we're in public institutions and, you know, you may need to alert people to something. And the best way to do that is just with a basic roll of caution tape. Scissors, never underestimate the power of scissors. And then again, making sure in, you know, even in your own car, in kind of a personal car toolkit, is to have some nitrile gloves and N95 dust masks, so that if you get to your institution and you find your emergency stash, your 5-gallon bucket floating in floodwaters, you're probably not going to want to use anything from there, so you at least have something. In the end, it's also really good to know where you can get some of these things. So is there a local hardware store that's near you, or a local Home Depot? And does everybody on staff know where those are? That could be a great training opportunity, is go over where, you know, you can get emergency supplies on short notice. You can go bigger if you're in a bigger institution. Just take the concept of the 5-gallon bucket and move it to the larger rolling garbage cans with lids. You know, then you can have paper towels and, you know, maybe other disaster supply kits for mopping up water, more, you know, have more of everything ready to go in a larger container. I highly recommend the garbage cans on wheels, because you do need to move this stuff around. And if you have wheels, it makes life a lot easier. I will also say, if you're including a lot of paper towels in your disaster supply kits, I had to resort to putting zip ties on my wheelie garbage cans at one of the institutions that I worked with, because the cataloging department seemed to be having a birthday party or a party of some ilk every week with snacks. And every time I would go to my disaster bin, because we had a leak, which was a common occurrence at this institution, I wouldn't have any paper towels. And that's because cataloging knew there were paper towels there. So they just go borrow my paper towels and then never replace them. So you can put a zip tie on there to keep curious eyes from taking the lid off. Just make sure you have some way to get that zip tie off easily in the event of a disaster. So, you know, but then also, you know, think about doing something with the disaster depot, either working with Christy in Northern New York or in your own region, because they can be very handy things. So, but again, not always easy in the odd times that we are in. So 5-gallon buckets work well. One of the things to really think about having in your disaster bucket, in your disaster wheelie bin, or to make sure that everybody on the disaster team has a copy of, is the salvage wheel. And this is something you can get from the American Institute for Conservation. It is a 2-sided wheel, and it goes through all of the basic steps of response that we're going to go through in just a bit on the one side. And then on the back side, it has helpful advice for how to salvage different types of collection materials. And what you'll notice is on the top, there are 2 little magnets. And so a lot of people I know, these are permanently attached to the, you know, their desk, to their filing cabinet, and they can grab that on their way out of their office and always have it as a reference point. And again, it's also great to have a spare in your disaster buckets or wheelie bins too. I want to go into some very basics of disaster response, because now that you have a plan, you are going to be more prepared to respond. But response isn't just running in, pulling out your plan, and getting really busy and doing things from the moment you set foot on your site. There are strategic priorities, and they will always go in this order. Safety first. You will always think about the safety of your people, your patrons first. If it's not safe to go in the building, okay, there's been a major ice storm and that lovely oak tree next to your building has fallen over and it's damaged your roof, it's broken a lot of glass. If you don't know and you can't get the front door open, don't go in the building, okay? Personal safety is always first. And it's hard to remember this. Not long after I started at Northwestern, we had a major flood. And they had just finished renovating the first floor to have a big kind of study commons with, tables and lots of computer equipment, and all of the outlets were in the floor. And none of us were used to this new setup yet. So as the water came rushing in through the front door, we all came up to respond and started walking into the area where the study commons was. And I look down and I see these outlets on the floor and pull everybody back out. We should have thought about it before we started walking in there, and thank heavens the power had gone out. But you always want to be thinking about human safety first. Then you want to make sure your structure is stable. So, boarding up windows, fixing holes in the roof, having, if it's been a major event, having somebody come to make sure, for example, if you go through a major flooding event like they did down in Corning, flooding events that are that major can actually shift buildings off their foundation, and you may not necessarily see that. So make sure if it's a major event like that, you get somebody in to check your building before you go in. So again, that safety first. Stabilize your building and then think about salvaging your collections. For a lot of us that have worked with local history collections, we become very attached. This is our local community's memory, and it's very, very precious to us. So the instinct when you arrive at your building is to rush in and start grabbing things and taking them out. But you do need to stop. Think about your health and safety first, stabilize the building, and then go in and start salvaging the collections. And how do we go about this? How can we think about this in a more structured sense? There is a definite order that you do things in a disaster response. And the first thing that you want to do is review. You're going to review what actually happened. You're going to review your disaster plan. You're going to review the people that you have available to you. If it's a major flood and you're blocked off and some people can't get to you, or their homes are flooded and their family comes first, you need to know what resources you're going to have. So you need to review those resources, those people. You need to review what sort of budget you may have for a response. And just look over all of this information so that when you can get in your building, and I'll tell you, if it's been a large natural disaster, you don't necessarily get access to your building for about 72 hours. Because if the fire department comes on site, they're not going to give you your building back until they are sure it is safe. So you have plenty of time to start reviewing things. You then want to assess the situation. And what we mean by this is to actually go in and perform a critical assessment. And what this assessment does is it gives you a 15 to 20 minute time frame to go in as a group of 3 or 4 people and assess the damage, assess what caused that damage, assess the location of the damage, and then assess what volume of damaged collections you have to deal with. And what this is going to do is it's your information gathering stage. So just as, we were talking about that gathering of phone numbers and all of that to write your plan, we need to gather the data. Okay, we are librarians. We love data. So we need to have that information in order to make informed decisions. So as you're gathering all of this information, you're also going to be taking a lot of photographs. And as you're photographs of details, photographs of the big picture. When I started in this field, we had one of the things we recommended in every disaster supply kit was a disposable camera with film or a collection of disposable cameras with film. And so you had to be very selective about what you took pictures of. Now, everybody's got a cell phone. We can all be taking pictures that are going to be very useful when we come back to start to plan. So you're going to be documenting everything both in writing and in photographs. And along with the damage, you're going to be looking at what health and safety considerations result from that damage. Do you have damaged electrical wiring? Is there glass around because windows were broken? Was it a major thunderstorm that caused a tree to fall, and now your library has a bunch of angry squirrels who've been displaced? And angry squirrels can be pretty nasty. So luckily, we're up here in the Northeast. So unless you're right around Lake George, you probably don't have to worry about poisonous snakes. But displaced animals can be just as dangerous as poisonous snakes. At least I think in New York, the only area that has rattlesnakes at least are up around the Lake George area. I've encountered them. They aren't fun. You want to be looking at what your building needs are. Do you need to get somebody in with plywood to board up windows? Do you need to get somebody to come in and fix the roof? Do you need to get somebody in to pump out your basement? And then you can look at what your collections need as well. So as you come in this group of 3 to 4 people, each person can be assigned with a task. So somebody can be taking pictures, somebody can be making notes on health and safety, somebody can be making notes on the building, and somebody can be making notes on the collections. And so if you're going in, be sure you have people that have a good understanding of health and safety needs and of your building. So you might bring your facilities person in as part of this assessment team, because if anybody knows the building, it's them. So the reason that we're doing this quick in and out 15 to 20 minute assessment is to gather that information that then allows us to create a plan. And it may seem counterintuitive to take the time to do this assessment and then create a plan, but in emergency management, we've learned over the years that, yes, time is of the essence, but if you go in without a plan, your recovery takes longer and costs more than if you took the time to do an assessment and make a plan. And so this assessment and planning process really only should take about a day. And then you are in a much better position to go in and start actually salvaging what you can, whether all you're salvaging is your building or if you're salvaging collections as well. So the plan is there to help, again, focus. And one of the resources that you'll get at the end of this webinar, when you get the slides and the recording, is a reference to David Carmichael's The Incident Command System for at the implementing the institution, too many I's in this title, implementing the incident command system at the institutional level. And it's a really good book on how to do disaster response, but the beauty of it is it comes full of forms that you can photocopy and fill out. So just as we were talking last week with risk assessment, you don't have to come up with all of that yourself. This book gives you all of the forms that you need to go in and do your critical assessment and to write your plan. So don't worry, there's a form for that, and it can be really, really helpful. So it helps to, making a plan helps you to clarify what tasks need to be completed and in what order some of those tasks need to be completed, because again, if your basement is flooded and half of your collections are in the basement, you're not going to go down and salvage collections until your basement has been pumped out. So you also want to be thinking now and in that assessment phase, whether or not you need to bring somebody in to help. So remember last week we talked about disaster recovery vendors. So Belfor, BMS Cat, and Polygon. I really, really can't recommend strongly enough that if your institution goes through a flood, and this is torrential rains causing a river to burst its bank and running through your institution, you get somebody else to come in and do the salvage for you, because you are going to have contaminated water and you will not have the knowledge or the equipment to handle that material safely. You know, even if it's a burst pipe. So, January happens in New York and pipes burst. So that at least is clean water, but it still may be a volume of water that's too much for you to handle on your own. And so that's why we talked last week about making contact, building a relationship with one of these recovery services so that they can come in more quickly and take care of everything that you need. And they can, depending on what you need, they can take care of it. So again, a good thing to have somewhat of an idea about ahead of time, before you need to just cold call them and they have to learn about you on the fly. So if you decide to do it yourself, of course, you need to have a plan as to where all of this work is going to take place, how many people you're going to need, what materials, supplies, and equipment you're going to need, how many tables, how many fans, how many paper towels, how much plastic. So to prevent over purchasing or having to waste time and send somebody out 5 or 6 times, have your plan. Make your plan so that when you go into the recovery phase, things go a lot more smoothly. But even if you have a plan, you just be aware and always keep it in the back of your head that full recovery can take a lot longer than you think. So, if you go through a major flood or, heaven forbid, a fire, it can take years, not months, for you to get back to functioning. And so, and functioning takes on different meanings. So, for example, when I was working in Massachusetts, Swans Island Library up in Maine got struck by lightning, and it was an 1880s building, and it just burned to the ground, nothing left. So it took them 3 years to rebuild their building, rebuild the collection, and get back up to functioning. Whereas somebody like the Cedar Rapids Public Library, whose main branch of their public library was flooded, I think about 12 feet of water was in the library, but they were able to, on a very short notice, find empty strip mall space. They moved into that space, sent out the notice that everybody who has books checked out, you can come here to check them back in, or any of our branches or other local communities in the area will take the books for you, and they had set up ahead of this flood a reciprocity agreement with other communities in the area. So if you had a Cedar Rapids, Iowa public library card, you could go within, say, a 20-mile radius and use the libraries on a regular basis. So that reciprocal arrangement became very, very valuable to them when the main library had to shut down for 2 years for renovations after the flood. So they were able to set up in a strip mall, but then also, distribute the services throughout the region. And so, these are strategies that can help you recover, because we, as libraries, supply very valuable services to our communities. And that doesn't just mean we let people check out books and DVDs and whatnot, but people come to us to use the computer and to use the Wi-Fi, and for the children's programs, and for all of the adult programming that we do, and the teen programming. And we're community centers, and even if we're not sponsoring an activity, everybody knows they can come to the library for the knitting circle, or the craft circle, or things of that nature. People know, well, at least knew, when I was growing up, everybody went to the library to get their tax forms, because that's where you got your tax forms. You go to the library now to check out tickets for local museums. We offer so many services that we need to remember that we're not just a building full of things to check out. There's so much more to recover. So be thinking in terms of that when you start thinking about what are some of our next steps. So if you haven't done it already, complete your pocket response plan and make sure it gets distributed to the people that need it. Plan a training event to share your new plan. It could just be yet another Zoom meeting. But at least it will be something, and it gets people thinking about it. Get a 5-gallon bucket, spray paint it red, and, make up a quick response kit. And then, if you offer a lot of services, you may want to look into expanding your disaster plan and creating what we call a continuity of operations plan. And that just takes the concepts that we've been thinking about in terms of risk assessment from natural disaster and whatnot to our collections, and what we usually think about for a lot of us as an emergency plan, which is how do we take care of our patrons if they slip and fall on the ice, or, somebody has a heart attack in the library, to how do we ensure that we can offer these services that we've become to be known for if we can't be in our building. So are there cooperative arrangements you can make with, a strip mall? So if there is space, you can move in there quickly and set up some computers. Can you work with the school? If school is not in session, can you move in there for a temporary space? There's a lot that you can think about. But for right now, the best thing you can do is to complete that pocket response plan. And then every year, think about adding a little bit more, because a full disaster plan and then a full continuity plan are two huge plans that really take mental energy to construct, but they don't have to be done in a week or a month. These are things that you can build on from a good, strong foundation. And this pocket response plan is really going to give you that strong foundation to keep building from where we are now. So that is disaster response, really quick and easy. I could have gone all day on disaster response. I've actually given 3 to 4 day workshops on disaster response, but those are the real nitty-gritty bits. So what I want to do is, again, open it up for questions, because in talking about response, there may be things related to and training that may be related to your disaster plan that have come up since we started the webinar. And I know some folks were in other meetings and have joined us late. So does anybody have any questions, either on working on your pocket response plan, or in terms of disaster response? Well, if you come up with something, my email is here on this last slide, and I always welcome emails with questions. I am happy to help. And with that, I think I will turn it back over to Christy.
Alrighty. Thank you so much, Danya. Have a great day. Have a good rest of your summer, and let's be in touch.